She walked quietly into the lecture hall, a simple woman in a gray cardigan. When the elite professor forced her to solve an impossible equation, everyone exchanged smirks. They were about to witness mathematics history and the most satisfying comeuppance this university had ever seen. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The lecture hall at Texas State University buzzed with anticipation as Professor Richard Harrington made his way to the podium. His reputation preceded him: distinguished mathematician, department head, and notorious for his disdain toward anyone he deemed intellectually inferior. Sarah Mitchell slipped into the back row, smoothing her simple gray cardigan over her white blouse. At 37, she stood out among the graduate students, but she wasn't there to blend in. She was there to learn. Today's symposium will address Riemann's hypothesis and its implications for quantum computing, Harrington announced, his voice commanding immediate silence. His silver beard and tailored blue suit projected authority as his eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Sarah. His mouth twitched with subtle disapproval. She'd seen that look before. The quick assessment, the dismissal. It was the same look she'd received when she'd applied for the university's maintenance staff position 3 years ago. The symposium began with presentations from doctoral candidates. Sarah took meticulous notes, her eyes lighting up during discussions of mathematical theories. When the floor opened for questions, her hand remained down. Experience had taught her that people like her weren't expected to speak in rooms like this. During the break, Sarah overheard two students whispering, "Who's the cleaning lady taking notes?" One snickered. "Probably just auditing for continuing education credits," the other replied dismissively. "Harrington hates when non-mathematics people attend these things." Sarah gripped her notebook tighter but maintained her composed expression. They didn't know that mathematics had been her companion since childhood, that she taught herself advanced calculus between night shifts while raising her daughter alone. They couldn't see the equations that danced in her mind when she closed her eyes. As the symposium resumed, Professor Harrington presented his controversial approach to an unsolved mathematical problem. His explanation was elegant, but contained a subtle flaw Sarah immediately recognized. She'd spent countless nights exploring this very equation. "Any questions?" Harrington asked, his tone suggesting he expected none worth answering. The room remained silent until Sarah almost involuntarily raised her hand. The moment her arm went up, she regretted it. Every head turned. Professor Harrington's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Yes, ma'am," he said, deliberate condescension coating his words. "I was wondering about the variable transformation in step 4, Sarah said, her voice softer than intended. "Wouldn't that create inconsistencies when applied to the boundary conditions?" The room went silent. Several students exchanged glances. Professor Harrington's expression hardened. "Your name?" he demanded. "Sarah Mitchell." "And your department?" Sarah hesitated. "I work in facilities management." A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. Harrington's face shifted from surprise to amusement. "Facilities management," he repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "How interesting. And you believe you found an error in my work?" Sarah's cheeks flushed. "Not an error exactly, just a potential complication that perhaps—" Harrington interrupted. "Instead of questioning established mathematical principles, you should focus on more accessible pursuits." Several students laughed. Sarah felt her face burn hotter as she shrank back into her seat, wishing she'd never raised her hand. What neither she nor anyone else in that room knew was that this moment of humiliation was about to become the catalyst for an extraordinary revelation. Professor Harrington wasn't done. Having found an easy target, he seemed determined to make an example of Sarah. "Since our guest from facilities management has such confidence in mathematical theory," he said, straightening his tie with deliberate slowness, "perhaps she'd like to demonstrate her expertise." He gestured toward the chalkboard. "Come forward, Ms. Mitchell." Sarah froze. Every instinct told her to decline, to escape. But something deeper, pride perhaps, or the exhaustion of being underestimated, pushed her to her feet. The walk to the front of the lecture hall felt endless. Each step echoed against the hardwood floor as whispers followed her path. She took the chalk from Harrington's outstretched hand, careful not to make direct eye contact. "Let's make this accessible," Harrington said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The word accessible dripped with condescension. He turned to the board and wrote a complex differential equation. Sarah recognized it immediately, a problem from advanced multivariate calculus. Difficult, but certainly not impossible for someone with proper training. The challenge wasn't in the equation itself, but in the public humiliation intended. Take your time, Harrington said with false generosity. We're all eager to learn from diverse perspectives. More laughter rippled through the audience. Sarah felt her hand trembling slightly as she stared at the board. Behind her, someone whispered, "This is painful to watch." Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a visiting professor from MIT seated in the front row, frowned at Harrington's display, but remained silent, watching Sarah with curious interest. Sarah took a deep breath. The numbers and symbols on the board began to arrange themselves in her mind, falling into patterns she'd recognized since childhood. She'd never had formal education beyond community college, but mathematics had been her refuge. During long nights after her husband left, after her daughter went to sleep, during breaks between cleaning bathrooms and mopping floors, she raised the chalk and made her first mark. "Perhaps we should simplify," Harrington began, but stopped when he saw Sarah confidently writing. The room grew quiet as she worked methodically through the problem. Her initial nervousness faded as she lost herself in the elegant dance of mathematics. She wasn't in a judgmental lecture hall anymore. She was in her own mind, where numbers had always made perfect sense. After 2 minutes of absolute silence, Sarah finished the final step, placed the chalk down, and stepped back. Harrington stared at the board, his expression shifting from smugness to confusion. He scanned her work, looking for mistakes, but found none. The solution was not only correct, but executed with surprising elegance. "That's correct," he admitted reluctantly, though anyone with basic calculus training could have managed it. Dr. Chen's eyebrows raised slightly as she exchanged glances with a colleague. Harrington, unwilling to concede defeat so easily, quickly erased the board. "Let's try something more challenging," he said, the edge in his voice more pronounced. "Something from my current research." He wrote a new equation, one Sarah didn't immediately recognize. This wasn't standard curriculum. It was cutting-edge theoretical mathematics, the kind published in specialized journals. "This problem has implications for quantum computing encryption," Harrington explained to the room, though his eyes remained fixed on Sarah. "If you'd prefer to return to your seat, I would certainly understand." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. The room held its collective breath, waiting for Sarah's retreat. Instead, she picked up the chalk again. Sarah examined the new equation, her initial confidence wavering. This was different, complex, abstract, with notation she'd never encountered in her self-study. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe she had overstepped. Maybe Harrington was right about her place. The silence in the room grew heavier as seconds ticked by. Students leaned forward in anticipation, some with pity in their eyes, others with barely disguised amusement. "As I suspected," Harrington said, reaching for the chalk, "perhaps we should continue with the symposium." "Wait," Sarah said quietly, pulling the chalk back. Something had clicked, a pattern within the chaos of symbols. She remembered an article she'd read last month during her lunch break, hunched over a library computer. It had discussed a novel approach to quantum encryption mathematics. She began to write, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. The tension in the room shifted as students exchanged confused glances. Even Harrington's smug expression faltered as he watched Sarah work through the problem with unexpected skill. Dr. Chen sat forward, her eyes widening as she watched Sarah's approach. It wasn't just that Sarah was solving the problem. She was taking an unconventional route, one that showed remarkable intuition. Halfway through the solution, Sarah paused, frowning at her work. There was a barrier. The equation seemed to lead to a dead end. Harrington's mouth curled into a satisfied smile. "A valiant attempt," he said, reaching again for the chalk. Sarah didn't relinquish it. Instead, she stared at the board, her mind racing. The room faded away as she focused entirely on the problem before her. Then, like a key turning in a lock, she saw the pathway forward, an elegant transformation that would simplify the entire equation. She began writing again, more confidently now. The scratching of chalk against board was the only sound in the hushed hall. When she applied her transformation, audible gasps came from the front row where the senior faculty sat. Dr. Chen whispered something to her colleague, who nodded vigorously. Harrington's face had lost all color. He was no longer watching Sarah's solution with disdain, but with growing alarm. What she was doing shouldn't have been possible, especially not from someone without formal training. "That's not the standard approach," he said sharply. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. She was too deeply immersed in the mathematics, in a state of flow she'd experienced all her life when working with numbers. She wasn't just solving Harrington's problem, she was improving upon it, finding efficiencies he hadn't seen. As she neared completion, tensions had shifted dramatically. The students who had laughed earlier were now silent, their expressions a mixture of confusion and respect. The professors in the front row were whispering urgently among themselves. Harrington himself seemed caught between contradictory impulses, a desire to maintain his authority and a professional fascination with the mathematical insight unfolding before him. Sarah had nearly reached the solution when Harrington suddenly moved to the board, examining her work closely. His finger traced one particular transformation she had used. "This simplification," he said, his voice tight with contained emotion. "Where did you learn it?" Sarah finally looked at him directly. "I didn't learn it. I just saw it." Their eyes met in a moment of silent confrontation. The prestigious professor and the maintenance worker standing before an equation that was bridging their worlds in ways neither had anticipated. Before Harrington could respond, Dr. Chen stood up from her seat. "That's the Lloyd Takahashi method," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. "Except it was only published in the International Journal of Quantum Mathematics last month." She fixed Sarah with an intense stare. "How could you possibly know about it?" The question hung in the air as every eye in the room turned to Sarah. Sarah stared at the chalk in her hand, suddenly aware of the crossroads before her. For years she had hidden her ability, convinced that no one would believe a single mother working maintenance could understand advanced mathematics. She'd been comfortable in the shadows, learning quietly, keeping her passion private. But now exposed in the spotlight, she had to choose: retreat into the safety of anonymity or stand in her truth. "I didn't know it was called the Low Takahashi method," she said, her voice stronger now. "I've never had formal training beyond community college." "Impossible," Harrington scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "These concepts require years of specialized education." Dr. Chen approached the board, examining Sarah's work more closely. "Yet here it is, perfectly executed." She turned to Sarah. "How?" Sarah took a deep breath. The weight of everyone's attention pressed against her. In that moment, she thought of her daughter, Lily, who was working double shifts to save for college. A daughter who had watched her mother shrink herself for years to avoid judgment. "Mathematics has always made sense to me," Sarah said simply. "When I look at equations, I see patterns, connections. Solutions reveal themselves if I look long enough." A student in the third row spoke up. "But you work in maintenance. Why aren't you—" "Because life happens," Sarah interrupted, a hint of steel entering her voice. "I had my daughter young. Her father left. I needed stable work with health insurance." She gestured to the partially completed solution on the board. "This doesn't pay bills or provide health care for a child." The room fell silent as the reality of her circumstances settled over the academic audience. "But why attend this symposium?" Harrington asked, genuinely puzzled now, rather than condescending. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Because I love mathematics. Because learning doesn't stop when life gets complicated." The chalk felt heavy in her hand as she turned back to the board. The unfinished equation waited, along with a decision that would change the trajectory of her life. She could stop now, return to her seat, go back to her predictable existence. Or she could finish what she started and fully reveal the mind she'd hidden for so long. Sarah lifted the chalk and turned to face the problem once more. Her hand no longer trembled. "I'm going to finish this," she said, more to herself than to the room full of academics. And with that simple declaration, Sarah Mitchell stepped into her power, ready to show these elite mathematical minds exactly what a simple woman from facilities management could do. Sarah turned back to the board, chalk poised. The room fell completely silent, a hush so profound that the scratch of chalk against blackboard echoed like thunder. Her mind cleared as she re-entered the world of pure mathematics, where social hierarchies and academic credentials meant nothing against the absolute democracy of correct answers. She worked through the remainder of the problem with fluid grace, her hand moving confidently across the board. When faced with a particularly thorny section, she paused, tilted her head slightly, then took an unexpected approach, creating a substitution that simplified the entire equation. Dr. Chen gasped audibly. "She's using dimensional analysis to collapse the quantum variance," she whispered to her colleague. "I've never seen anyone approach it that way." Harrington stood rigid, his expression unreadable as Sarah's solution unfolded. It wasn't just correct. It was innovative, elegant, the kind of mathematical thinking that went beyond mere calculation. When Sarah placed the final value in a neat box and stepped back, no one spoke. The solution glowed on the blackboard like a revelation. It wasn't just that she had solved Harrington's challenge. She had improved upon it, found efficiencies that hadn't been published in any journal. Dr. Chen was the first to break the silence. "That's remarkable," she said, approaching the board. "You've collapsed 3 steps into one with this transformation." She turned to the room. "This isn't just correct, it's brilliant." A murmur spread through the audience. Students who had snickered earlier now looked at Sarah with undisguised awe. Several professors had pulled out their phones, discreetly photographing her work. Harrington cleared his throat. "While unconventional, I suppose the approach has merit," he conceded reluctantly. The words seemed painful for him to speak. "Merit?" Dr. Chen challenged, turning to him with raised eyebrows. "Richard, this solution could advance our understanding of quantum encryption mathematics. This is publishable work." Sarah stood quietly, chalk dust coating her fingers, feeling strangely detached from the commotion beginning to stir around her. This hadn't been about proving anyone wrong. She'd simply answered the challenge before her as best she could. "Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Chen said, turning to face her directly, "have you documented any of your other mathematical insights?" Sarah hesitated. "I have notebooks, just things I work on at night when I can't sleep." "Notebooks?" Harrington repeated, his professional curiosity finally overtaking his pride. "What kind of mathematics do you explore?" "Different things," Sarah replied, suddenly self-conscious again. "Number theory mostly. Some work on prime factorization algorithms." Dr. Chen and Harrington exchanged startled glances. Prime factorization was at the heart of cryptography research, one of the most sophisticated areas of applied mathematics. "I'd like to see these notebooks," Dr. Chen said firmly. A student from the front row stood up. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen," he declared, and began to applaud. Others joined in, the sound building until it filled the lecture hall. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, rather than shame this time. The applause wasn't something she had sought or expected. As the applause continued, she caught the eye of a young woman in the back row, a student who had been watching intently throughout the entire demonstration. The young woman nodded at her with profound respect, as if witnessing something life-changing. In that moment, Sarah realized her actions hadn't just been about mathematics. She had become visible, truly visible, for the first time in her adult life. Her knowledge, her mind, her potential had stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The applause eventually subsided, but something had fundamentally changed in that lecture hall, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had witnessed her transformation from invisible to extraordinary. The symposium had officially disbanded an hour ago, but the lecture hall remained crowded. Sarah found herself surrounded by professors and graduate students, all asking questions about her mathematical insights. Dr. Chen hadn't left her side, almost protective in her presence. "Your intuitive grasp of multidimensional analysis is extraordinary," a quantum computing professor told her. "Have you ever considered formal study?" Sarah gave a sad smile. "Consider it? Yes. Afford it? No." Across the room, Professor Harrington was engaged in intense conversation with the department dean. His gestures were animated, occasionally pointing in Sarah's direction. His earlier condescension had morphed into something more complex, a reluctant professional respect. tinged with defensiveness. Dr. Chen touched Sarah's arm gently. "We should talk about your future," she said quietly. "MIT has fellowship programs designed for exceptional cases like yours." Sarah looked at her, startled. "MIT? Me? Talent like yours doesn't come along often," Dr. Chen replied. "It would be mathematical malpractice to let it go unnurtured." The crowd around Sarah parted as Professor Harrington approached. His silver beard seemed to quiver slightly with suppressed emotion. "Mitchell," he said formally, "the department would like to review your notebooks if you're willing. There might be opportunities to discuss." His words were measured, careful. It wasn't quite an apology, but from a man like Harrington, it was the closest thing to one. Sarah nodded. "I'll bring them tomorrow." "I'll be reviewing them personally, Doctor." Chen interjected with a pointed look at Harrington that made his mouth tighten. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Sarah gathered her belongings. Her phone showed 5 missed calls from the babysitter. Real life was calling, a stark reminder of the practical considerations that had always constrained her mathematical pursuits. Walking toward the exit, she was stopped by a young female student. "Miss Mitchell," the student said hesitantly, "I'm studying engineering, and I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" Sarah asked. "For showing that where you start doesn't determine what you know." The student's eyes were bright with emotion. "I'm a first-generation college student from a rural town. People make assumptions about me, too." Sarah felt something warm unfold in her chest. She hadn't considered how her moment might affect others. Outside the building, the evening air felt different somehow, charged with possibility. Sarah took a deep breath, thinking about the notebooks waiting at home, filled with years of solitary mathematical exploration. Tomorrow, those private thoughts would be examined by some of the country's top mathematical minds. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. For the first time in years, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where her mind, not her uniform, defined her. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a different classroom, this one smaller with eager undergraduate faces, watching her explain a complex theorem. The sleeves of her gray cardigan were pushed up as she wrote across the whiteboard. No longer hesitant or apologetic about claiming space, her life had transformed with breathtaking speed. After that symposium, Dr. Chen had arranged an emergency fellowship, recognizing that talent like Sarah's couldn't wait for traditional academic timelines. 2 of her theoretical approaches had already been published, with her name listed as the primary author. Professor Harrington had come around too, though it had taken time and several departmental meetings where he'd been outvoted. Now he grudgingly acknowledged her insights, especially after her work on quantum encryption had attracted attention from research institutions across the country. The biggest change, though, was internal. Sarah no longer hid her intelligence or passion. She spoke with authority about her work, knowing her value didn't derive from credentials, but from the power of her mind. Her daughter Lily had transferred to the university on a full scholarship, inspired by her mother's example to pursue her own dreams without apology. As Sarah finished her explanation, a student raised her hand, a young woman with uncertainty in her eyes but determination in her question. Sarah called on her immediately, remembering what it felt like to be unseen. "Never be afraid to raise your hand," she told her students. "The question you're afraid to ask might change everything, not just for you, but for everyone in the room." If Sarah's journey from overlooked to extraordinary touched your heart, remember that genius exists in unexpected places, often hidden by circumstances, not lack of ability. Who might you be underestimating in your own life? We'd love to hear your stories of hidden talents discovered. Where are you watching from today? Share in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of recognition and transformation, please subscribe for more glimpses of extraordinary moments that change lives forever. Sometimes the greatest minds aren't found in lecture halls, but cleaning them. Like, share, and join our community of storytellers celebrating unsung heroes everywhere.